Internet, and welcome to this, my US Road Trip Diaries of Volume 7. In this, we shall leave the town of Las Vegas and travel all the way through Arizona, watching Wild West shootouts in Tombstone, trying and failing miserably to find cacti in Tucson, nearly being arrested for being Mexican border runners in southern Arizona, feeling bad about ourselves in the Apache Indian territory, and reassuring people that we don't actually intend to stay in Payson, before finally moving up and finishing our trip with, or this particular video, with our stop at the Grand Canyon. So yeah, enjoy. Leaving Las Vegas, we set out south for Black Canyon City, where we had decided that our first plan was to stay that particular day, trying to see as much as we could on the way. Passing over the Hoover Dam, as you had to do back then, since that was where the southbound road led. Today there is an interstate going past it, so you actually have to drive off the interstate in order to see the Hoover Dam. But we drove straight over it, stopping at the local parking spot for a few poster pictures, which is amazing. It's a fairly interesting place to see. We considered southbound towards Black Canyon City. For the first part of the trip, from Kingman to Seligman, going west to east, we were traveling at basically the last sort of remaining real part of the old Route 66. If you want to have the Route 66 experience, guys, this is basically where you need to go and find it. From Kingman to Seligman, or the other way around, instead of taking the interstate further south. But we did. We took some various pictures of Route 66 signs. We marveled at the refurbished 50s restaurants and so on. But overall, eventually, it is, of course, a piece of road like many others. So we eventually hit the interstate and headed south towards our destination. It was on this trip on the way south that we tried something that I have never tried any other place in Arizona. We got rain. Thunderclouds were gathering, the sky was darkening into a pitch black, and we got like the flood of almost 6 drops upon our windscreen. Yeah, I might have overdone that just a tiny bit, but yeah, that was that was the rain we got in Arizona, and that is all the rain I have ever gotten in Arizona. This year, I'm going back in November, so, there is maybe hope for seeing something there, but until now, the rain I have suffered in Arizona was 6 drops from one slightly grey cloud. Anyway, reaching Black Canyon City, it was still basically early afternoon, so we decided, screw that, and continue south. We headed to Phoenix, wanted to see how long that would take. It's actually a pretty beautiful way down from the north to Phoenix on the motorway, on the interstate. If you ever go that way, I think I said in my travel diaries from the traveling vlog I did from my visit in Arizona in June, that it has one of the most beautiful landscapes around, and it really does. But eventually, like I said, we headed to Phoenix and continued further south, and we decided we would stay in Tucson. That would fit very well with today's travel, but first we would go out and see the Saguaro National Park, because we have read Donald Duck as well, so we wanted to see saguaro cacti. And we knew that if we turned off the interstate, we would come to the Western Saguaro National Park. Except we apparently didn't realize where to turn off. This was the days before GPS on our trips, however, after all. So we eventually found ourselves in the middle of nowhere. There was some very interesting cattle farms, and we also found a very small Indian reservation with apparently only like 300 people living there, if even that many. It was all very interesting, but there were very, very few cacti. Even that was actually one of the few places in southern Arizona where there wasn't cacti everywhere, so we were quite screwed. But eventually we did manage to spend a few hours to go there, and eventually, we spent a few hours looking, and eventually we found the Saguaro National Park, arriving just after the park had closed for the evening. Of course, that didn't mean we couldn't drive in around the sort of area, just meant that we couldn't get to the visitor center. So we saw as many cacti as our heart would allow, which wasn't all that many because it soon got dark, and we turned our car around, found our way back to the interstate, and went into Tucson to settle in for the night. The next day was one of those days that we drove a lot and saw quite a bit. It was actually one of the most sort of, not, I won't say action-packed because there was a lot of driving experience, but it was one of those where I have a lot of stories to tell. The first thing we did leaving Tucson was go south a couple of hours to Tombstone because, well, anyone with even a minor interest in the Wild Wild West will, of course, have had some interest in Tombstone, Wyatt Earp and everything. We saw Boot Hill, always interesting, always fascinating. Definitely go there. I was there again this year. It's still very interesting. We walked around the old Tucson town, and while it is, of course, a tourist trap, it's actually one of the somewhat still least tourist traps I've ever seen. It's very, very fascinating, but definitely go there. We did think about staying a couple of extra hours to watch the sort of reenactment of the OK Corral gunfight, but since my father had already been in Tucson a few years earlier and had heard that it was basically a sort of semi-embarrassing amateur theater thing, we decided to instead move on. This year, in 2017, I was there and basically watched the show to, see what it actually was about. And I can tell everyone that if back then it was a embarrassing amateur theater show, today it's an amazing amateur theater show. It definitely takes some license with history and some not entirely telling the full and truth story, but yeah, go see it. It's brilliant and it's really, really funny. I had a lot of fun, and so did all the kids that was with me there, so yeah, go and see that. But eventually, having had enough of Tombstone, again, let me just say, go to Tombstone. It's actually really, really interesting in and of itself, not just because of the whole Wyatt Earp thing. It is very, very interesting, and you should go there. But eventually, we left, turning south towards Bisbee, where we found, to our surprise, what you see in the picture, a huge open-air copper mine. It's basically, again, this huge man-made hole in the ground, and it's astounding. There isn't much else to see. Bisbee itself can be interesting, again, an old Wild West town, but again, yeah, just this hole was what stayed with me. It was at this point that we made what, to a certain degree, gave us a little bit of issues later, because we decided that we wanted to see the Mexican border. Now, we had no intention of going into Mexico, and we weren't allowed to take the car there anyway, but we wanted to see the Mexican border, so we continued south until we hit the Mexican border in some town that I have forgotten the name of. This is really, really embarrassing. Douglas was his name. It was called Douglas, which is a fairly small town on the American side, but a very big town on the Mexican side. However, what we did see in Douglas was our first view of a, sort of chain gang. Never seen that before. A bunch of orangey-clad gentlemen working out by the side of the road with heavily armed police officers walking up and down them in a row. So yeah, that was something. Deciding to move towards Payson for the evening, we were originally going to go up through the San Carlos Indian Reservation, which is basically where most of the surviving Apache groups are stationed now and again. But on the way, about 20 miles north of Douglas, we were pulled over by a Border Patrol police officer because apparently two fat Scandinavian white dudes in a bright red Chevy Camaro sports car was just the kind of persons to be Mexican border runners. And we were actually held up for nearly 20 minutes while they asked us quite a lot of questions, checked our passports, rechecked our passports, asked us more questions, and then rechecked our passports. I was basically expecting them to also take a look at our car to see if we had maybe been smuggling stuff, but eventually they apparently decided that we just weren't, border runnery enough to actually deal with, so they let us go. So yeah, that was sort of my first real close shave with American, shall we call it, authorities. In this case, thank God Trump wasn't president. We would have never gotten past the wall. Moving up towards, again, Payson and the San Carlos Indian Reservation, we went through what was part then, probably still is today, of probably the poorest area in the continental United States. Most people there live for very, very little a year, and what we saw, I think we saw one house that wasn't just, metal plates put together in kind of a shed kind of thing, with some fairly sullen people standing at them, looking at the two fat Danish guys in a bright red sports car. This might in fact have been the only time ever in America that I have sort of kind of felt a bit of, I don't know, white guilt, personal guilt, whatever you might call it. That was not the best experience. I've been in, shall we call them, dangerous areas before and since. I have dealt with people who were not necessarily happy to see a fat Danish white guy, but this was the first and only time I've ever been in America where I actually felt like, yeah, I don't feel comfortable being here, because I honestly feel like my presence is not just unwanted, but yeah, not very nice at all. But eventually we got to Payson, where we had a fine dinner at a local Mexican restaurant that was really, really good. Bought some new clothes at a Walmart, and then tried to check into the hotel. And this was where we got the second sort of hold up of the day, because checking into a hotel usually takes 5 minutes, then you get a room and go on. In this particular case, however, we was trying to check in at a local Best Western, and the girl at the front desk was quite willing to check us in, but then she made the mistake of asking us who we were and where we were from, and we told her that we were Danish from Denmark, or Fanes from Fenmark, to quote a friend of mine. And we were there on vacation. And literally, she stopped doing what she was doing. Her eyes became wide as teacups, and she basically just stared at us in shock for about 30 seconds before she managed to blurt out, "Vacation? Here?" And it was like, well, yeah, here, but I mean, it took us about 5 minutes to convince her that, yes, we were just moving on to somewhere else. Don't worry about it. We haven't, I don't know, lost our mind by trying to spend some time in Payson. Again, like I said, it should have taken us 5 minutes to check in and get our room. It ended up taking us about 20 minutes trying to calm down this poor girl who apparently thought that we were crazy people for coming to the place she lived in. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about that, honestly. It just always amuses me. But that day ended, and the next one would bring us to Holbrook and to the Painted Desert. From Payson, we headed north to Flagstaff because our car was starting to say that it needed service, and we wanted to go find an Avis office to have them tell us what to do, and they told us that we didn't have to worry about it. It was a sort of resetting of the systems in the computer. So, we moved on from that and went to see something called Montezuma's Castle. It is one of the ancient cliff dwellings of southwestern United States, this one from around 11 to 1300, and people apparently thought when they originally came here that it was the Aztec Emperor Montezuma who had a outpost or a fortress here. It absolutely wasn't. It was way before Montezuma. It was practically even before the Aztecs, and Montezuma never even probably knew that Arizona existed at that particular juncture. However, the place is actually very interesting if you feel the urge to look at cliff dwellings. There are also the great cliff dwellings further north that we will be talking about some other time, but in this particular case, if you want to see a cliff dwelling, go there. Moving north, we also check the Great Meteor Crater, one of the most sort of well-preserved meteor craters of all time, where about 50,000 years ago, a 300,000-ton nickel-iron meteor smashed into the ground and left, well, this giant, very well-preserved meteor crater, one of the most well seen in the world, and that was very interesting. Unfortunately, there was a storm warning coming up, and we could actually this time see storm clouds in the distance, so walking around at the top of a high meteor crater in an otherwise very flat plain was not something we enjoyed, so we left again. Of course, the way we were driving, we never saw even a single drop of rain, as you would have already guessed from before. But again, if you get to the area, go see the meteor crater if you have any interest in geology or, well, basically anything having to do with meteors or craters, to be perfectly honest. However, we eventually reached Holbrook and went out to see the petrified forest, which is where several trees from, the Mesozoic or earlier, the dinosaur times, went under water and eventually petrified, and when the water receded, now they're just lying around, which is like basically, lumps of rock, but are in fact petrified wood, and it's very, very interesting to see. We also went to the Painted Desert, where there's a bunch of really interesting rock formations in very interesting colors because of striating layers and various kinds of rock types. Also there, again, had lived some of the earlier Americans, and they were doing a lot to do with petroglyphs. As you can see in the current picture, there's a petroglyph stone. We saw quite a lot of petroglyphs, and of course, because our own ancestors in Scandinavia did a lot with petroglyphs as well, we found that very interesting. But eventually, nothing really sort of funny happened that day. It was just all very interesting. All of these things are things you should see. The petroglyphs, the Painted Desert, the petrified forest, and the meteor crater, all very interesting. Go see it. But eventually, we returned to Holbrook and got some sleep before moving up to what will be the last part of this particular video, Grand Canyon. Well, the next day we moved back towards Flagstaff, because that was where we needed to go in order to get north to the canyon area. And while at Flagstaff, which is a very interesting part of Arizona that I wish to someday have more time to root around in, because it's so unlike the southern part of it and actually very, very interesting, we decided to check out the Sunset Crater volcanic basin, a group of volcanoes over a magma chamber that erupted and formed these volcanoes about 1,000 to 1,300 years ago, and covered most of the area currently north of Flagstaff with a large lava field, but also, of course, allowed the various ash clouds and so on to create a very fertile area, which Flagstaff is enjoying even today. Now, my parents had been there a few years earlier and had decided that the prices to get in to the actual sort of walking paths around the volcanic cones was very highly overpriced, and there was no way they were going to pay it. But I said to my father, don't worry, I want to see this. This is something I want to see. I'm going to pay it. And he eventually mostly agreed to accept that I would take on this financial burden. So when we arrived, I brought out my wallet and found a big $100 note and realized that the price that was so exorbitant that my parents absolutely could not pay it was $5. Yeah. I don't know what that tells you about my parents, but eventually me and my dad did go in and see the volcanic walking trails. It's really, really interesting walking around this sort of broken and bouldered old lava territories with withered trees and new trees and shrubbery and so on. If you get to the area, you should definitely go see it. It's very interesting, and it's very, very fascinating to see. However, moving further north, we eventually arrived in Williams. Williams is a tourist town where a lot of people who goes to see the Grand Canyon stays. It's some 30-40 miles south of the canyon, so it's a good place to sort of stay in the various hotels. Then if you're only there for a day, you can drive up, see the canyon, drive back again. And of course, there's also a steam train going there, which takes a couple of hours, but also has a great view over the areas in between Grand Canyon and Williams, but also has a staged, train robbery. So there is a bit of entertainment at the same time, if that suits your interest. My parents have tried it. They said it was really funny. We, of course, did not. We did, however, get a very good lunch at a 50s-style diner in Williams, which had probably the only really good hot dog I've ever gotten in America. If there's one thing Americans can't do, it's hot dogs, which I have stated before and will continue to state. Williams itself is a sort of weird mix between an obvious tourist destination and an attempt to recreate the view of a small town America in the West in the 50s. And again, I'm not really sure if it succeeds, but it's at least some interesting aesthetic you don't see practically anywhere else. So yeah, Williams is interesting. But of course, we didn't really have any interest in Williams because we were going to the Grand Canyon, and we weren't staying at Williams because we had paid a lot of money to have a hotel up at Grand Canyon Village, which is a small community right next to the actual, well, canyon. So that was the plan. So we went up there and we entered the national park, or using again our yearly pass. Was for a while stopped by the wonderful deer you can see in the picture that didn't want to move from the roadway. But eventually we did get into the got close to the canyon, and then realized it was noon and we couldn't get our hotel rooms until 3 o'clock. So what did we plan to do? Well, we decided that originally we had planned to see the eastern part of the canyon on the last day there when we were leaving, because we were going to take the eastern exit from the park anyway. But now we decided that, well, we could go out there and see that now, because it would take some time. There were about 20 miles out there, and yeah, that was what we decided to do. There are several viewing areas on the way, but we decided that my first view of the canyon should be from a viewing point out near an old reconstruction, or a reconstruction of an old Indian observation on guard tower that they have created out near the eastern entrance. My father thought that was the first time I should see the canyon, so yeah, we didn't hold into any. It could have taken us less time than the about 45 minutes we did, but I need to remind you all, this is a national park, so speed limit is about 45 miles per hour at most anywhere. So if you go to the Grand Canyon and only has a day, you need to take this into consideration when you're doing the planning for what you have time to do. Well, eventually we did arrive at the parking spot for this viewing point and placed the car there and moved out to the view area under the recreation of the Indian Guard Tower. And this is where I'm getting lost for words. I have seen a lot of pictures of the Grand Canyon. I have taken a crap ton of pictures of the Grand Canyon. I have seen videos. I have seen flyovers. I have seen, flyover videos. I've seen documentaries about the Grand Canyon, but pictures and videos in no way do it credit. In order to sort of understand how magnificent and grand the Grand Canyon is, you have to be there yourself, and I don't think I have seen anywhere that is as awesome for that as sort of a first view of the Grand Canyon than this particular viewing spot out near the eastern edge of the national park, on the by the way, southern edge of the canyon. It's where the Grand Canyon sort of takes a bend. Parts of it where you're standing, you can see it go straight north for a long while. Parts of it go straight southwest for a long time. And it's like this enormous hole in the ground, several miles wide, a mile deep, with a raging torrent of water at the bottom, and hundreds and hundreds of miles long. So long that you can't see the edge, but it also just looks like it's disappearing in the heat sort of days that are going on at the time. I'm at a loss for words. This is something you need to see. This is something everyone needs to see. It is amazing, it is brilliant, and it is wonderful. With the possible exception of Hurricane Ridge up in Washington State and maybe one or two other places, it's probably the most sort of breathtaking and magnificent natural spectacle I have seen in the United States of America. Everyone who has watched my videos and everyone who knows me knows how hard I am to get to shut up. And as you can hear, I am still, 7 years later, absolutely lost for words at the memory of the glory of that particular first view of the Grand Canyon. Yeah. Anyway, having spent our time at the Grand Canyon, out at the canyon, we've decided to go back, and now we thought we could get our hotel rooms. And we could. However, this was where we realized that something me and my dad had become experts at doing. We had arrived at the Grand Canyon in a weekend. And that meant that there was a crap ton of people there, because people were coming up from wherever they were just to see the Grand Canyon and go home again the next day. And, yeah. I am not entirely sure what to say. My dad was going in to get to check us in, and there was absolutely no place I could park. So I was doing like a sort of mini Indy 500 thing. For 20 minutes, I was driving around a fairly small parking space, just basically going about 15 meters in front, turning a big left, going 15 meters back, turning a big left. I was going in this oval for about 20 minutes, following very slow cars in front of me. That was also an experience, but not quite as breathtaking as the actual canyon, let me tell you. However, eventually we got checked in and got to our hotel room, which had, surprisingly enough, actually a parking spot, quite secluded, only about maybe 300 feet away. We only had to cross the railway track of the before-mentioned steam train going down from, or coming up from Williams. Anyway, we got into a hotel room. It was fairly small, but what it did have, what was we paid for? It had canyon view. By that I mean it's built less than 15 feet or maybe 20 feet from the actual canyon edge, and we were on the second floor, so of course the view was rather spectacular and would become even more so in the evening with the sunset, and even more so the next morning with the sunrise. But I'll get back to that in the next video, because we went down to the local restaurant at the hotel, which was actually fairly interesting because it had a lot of waiters running around that had apparently chosen to come up to work here for a while, because all of them had beyond their names also the countries they were originally from. And if I'm not mistaken, we were served by some guy from Venezuela back then. Maybe not Venezuela, I think it was one of the South American countries. We got some fairly decent burgers and went back to our room, because the next day we were going out to see the western part of the canyon, and because we didn't want to be completely overwhelmed by tourists, we wanted to catch the earliest bus, which was just before 6 a.m. in the morning, so we wanted to get up around 5 to also catch the sunrise. So yeah, that was that particular trip through Arizona. I'll hope you liked it. Well, that was it. Yet another road trip diary over with. I am aware that these are not exactly my most popular videos, at least they get by far the lowest view count, but yeah, I like doing them, and I know a couple of you like seeing them, so I hope those of you who do have enjoyed this one. This was one of the more interesting ones, at least, and seeing Arizona, which is today one of my favorite states, so yeah. That's always very interesting. Next time we will be moving around the Grand Canyon and finishing up in Moab, up in Utah, where we had by far the best and most interesting experience of the entire trip. So yeah, until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.